The gravel road to town crossed Millstone Creek at a narrow point where the banks pinched together, and the bedrock rose just high enough to keep the water shallow most of the year. James Calloway had driven over that crossing twice a week for 19 years, hauling feed and supplies back to the family ranch, and in all that time the water had never risen above the hubcaps of his truck. His father had used the same crossing for 30 years before that, and his grandfather before him. The ranch sat on the north side of the creek, 5 miles from the nearest paved road, and the crossing was the only practical way in or out, unless you wanted to add 40 miles through fire roads that turned to mud every spring. The family treated the crossing like furniture. It was just there, solid and reliable, part of the landscape you stopped noticing after enough repetitions. The crossing worked because of geology and history converging at the right point. The creek ran through a valley carved over millennia, but at this one spot, the bedrock rose close to the surface, creating a natural ford where the water spread wide and shallow across hard stone. James's grandfather had improved it decades ago, hauling in gravel to level the approach and placing larger rocks at strategic points to break the current. The improvements had worked so well that 3 generations had come to think of the crossing as permanent infrastructure rather than what it actually was, a temporary arrangement that depended on the creek staying within historical bounds. Nobody thought about those bounds much. The creek behaved predictably, rising a bit in spring, dropping low in summer, freezing at the edges in winter. Year after year, the pattern held, and the pattern bred confidence that it would always hold. James noticed it differently after the winter of 2019. That year, the snowpack in the ridge country above the ranch measured nearly double the historical average, and the weather reports kept mentioning an unusually warm spring forecast. He'd driven up into the high country in late February to check a fence line, and when he'd reached the upper meadows, he'd seen snow depths he couldn't remember from any previous year. The drifts stood higher than the fence posts in some places, and the whole landscape lay buried under a white blanket that would eventually turn into millions of gallons of runoff. He stood there looking at it, doing rough calculations in his head, trying to estimate how much water would come down the creek when the melt started in earnest. The numbers didn't comfort him. He stood at the main crossing in late February, watching the ice shelf along the banks, and did the math more carefully. If the melt came fast and the ground stayed frozen underneath, all that water would have nowhere to go but downstream. The crossing sat in a natural funnel. When the flow picked up, it would hit that bottleneck hard. The bedrock that made the crossing possible in normal years would become a constraint that forced higher water through a narrow gap, and if the volume exceeded the capacity, the water would either overflow the banks or start tearing apart the gravel roadbed his grandfather had built. Either way, the crossing would become impassable and the ranch would be cut off. He mentioned it at dinner that night, trying to keep his tone casual, and his wife Laura looked up from her plate with a tired smile and said the crossing had been fine for 50 years and would be fine this year too. His brother-in-law Eric, who managed the ranch alongside him, shook his head and said James worried too much about things that never happened. His teenage daughter Anna just scrolled through her phone and asked if they could talk about something that actually mattered. James let it drop, but the idea stayed with him. He started paying attention to the weather forecasts more closely, noting the temperature trends and the precipitation predictions. The pattern emerging was one he didn't like, a colder-than-average late winter, followed by a rapid temperature spike in early spring. That combination meant the snowpack would stay intact longer and then melt faster when the warmth finally arrived, concentrating the runoff into a shorter window. He tried explaining this to Eric one morning while they were fixing a gate, and Eric said the creek had handled plenty of spring melts before and would handle this one too. James said this melt might be different, and Eric said different didn't mean dangerous, and besides, what was James proposing they do about it anyway? James didn't have an answer yet, so he let the conversation end there. A week later, he walked the creek again, this time upstream, following the banks for nearly 2 miles until he found a spot where the canyon walls squeezed together and the bedrock formed natural anchor points on both sides. The gap measured roughly 60 feet across, and the walls rose 20 feet above the winter water level. The location had several advantages. The canyon walls were solid basalt. The banks were high enough that even a major flood wouldn't reach the bridge level, and an old logging trail ran along the far side that could be rehabilitated to connect back to the ranch through higher ground. If he could span that gap with a suspension bridge, the family would have an alternate route when the spring melt came. The bridge would add maybe 15 minutes to the trip into town, but it would keep them mobile if the main crossing flooded. He stood there for an hour, taking measurements with a tape measure and writing notes, imagining how the structure would work. Before we go further, if you're watching this from a place where the seasons change hard and the infrastructure only works when nature cooperates, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Because what happens next isn't just about one man and one bridge. It's about the cost of assuming tomorrow will look like yesterday and what it takes to prepare when nobody else thinks you should. He sketched the idea in a notebook that night, working out load calculations and tension ratios, based on formulas he'd learned from a civil engineering textbook he'd picked up at a library sale years ago. The basic design was straightforward. 2 main cables spanning the gap, anchored at both ends to the bedrock, with a walking surface suspended between them. The cables would carry the structural load through tension, and the deck would transfer weight to the cables through direct attachment. He calculated that braided steel cable rated for 3,000 pounds, properly tensioned across a 60-foot span, could safely support a dynamic load of at least 500 pounds, more than enough for a person carrying supplies. The deck would need to be lightweight but strong enough to walk on, and the handrails would need to provide stability without adding excessive weight. He worked through the calculations twice, checking his math, and when he finished, he felt confident the design would work. When he showed Laura the drawings over breakfast, she asked why he was wasting time on a project they didn't need. James explained that they might need it very soon, that the snowpack was unprecedented, and the main crossing wasn't designed for the kind of flows they could see this spring. Laura said the crossing had never failed before, and James was catastrophizing, turning a normal spring melt into some kind of disaster scenario that probably wouldn't happen. She asked if he'd talked to anyone else about this, like the county road department or other ranchers in the valley, and James admitted he hadn't, because he knew what they'd say, that the crossing had always worked and would keep working. Laura said maybe they'd say that because it was true, and James said maybe they'd say it because people had short memories and got comfortable with risks they'd gotten away with so far. Eric saw the notebook a few days later and laughed, saying James should stick to fixing fences instead of playing engineer. James said he wasn't playing, that the bridge was a legitimate backup plan for a legitimate risk, and Eric said risk management meant focusing on likely problems, not imaginary ones. He pointed out that they had real work that needed doing, equipment to maintain, cattle to manage, repairs that had been postponed through the winter, and spending time on a bridge nobody needed was poor resource allocation. James said the bridge would take maybe 2 weeks of work spread over a couple months, and Eric said 2 weeks they didn't have to spare. The disagreement simmered without resolution, and James decided he'd build the bridge on his own time after the regular work was done. He started buying materials anyway. He drove into town and picked up 200 feet of braided steel cable rated for 3,000 pounds, along with turnbuckles, shackles, and hardware for the anchors. The cable came on a heavy wooden spool, and he had to get 2 workers from the hardware store to help him load it into his truck bed. He bought treated lumber for the walkway, 2x6s that would be light enough to carry up the canyon, but strong enough to support weight, and smaller rope for the handrails and deck lacing. The cashier at the hardware store asked what he was building, and James said a backup bridge, and the cashier nodded politely without asking why. The total came to just over $1,200, and when James paid with the ranch account card, he knew Laura would see the transaction on the next statement. She did. Back at the ranch, he loaded the materials into the barn and set them aside, telling himself he'd start when he found time between the usual work. Laura saw the coil of cable one morning and asked how much it cost, and when he told her, she went quiet for a moment and then said they could have used that money for the new water heater they'd been putting off. James said the bridge mattered more, and Laura said it only mattered if the crossing actually failed, which it never had. She said spending $1,200 on a hypothetical problem while ignoring real problems like a water heater that barely worked anymore was backwards priority setting. James said the water heater was an inconvenience, but losing the crossing would be a crisis, and Laura said he was inventing a crisis to justify a project he wanted to build anyway. The conversation ended there, but the tension hung in the air for days, surfacing in small ways. Clipped responses, avoided eye contact, the kind of friction that builds when people disagree about something fundamental and can't find common ground. Anna heard them arguing one night and came downstairs to ask what was going on. When James explained he was building a bridge in case the creek flooded, Anna said that sounded paranoid, like he was preparing for the apocalypse or something. James said it wasn't paranoia to prepare for a predictable risk, and Anna said, if it was so predictable, why didn't anyone else think it was a problem? James said most people didn't think about risks until they happened, and by then it was too late to prepare. Anna said that sounded like something a conspiracy theorist would say, and James felt the conversation slipping away from him into territory where facts didn't matter, and he'd already lost by caring too much. He let it drop and went back upstairs, and the next morning Anna told her friends at school that her dad was building a bridge to nowhere, and the whole family thought he was overreacting. James started work on the bridge in early March. He woke before dawn one Saturday and drove the old ranch ATV up the logging trail to the canyon site, towing a small trailer loaded with tools and the first batch of materials. The logging trail hadn't been used in years, and the first mile required him to stop repeatedly to clear fallen branches and fill washouts with gravel he'd brought in the trailer. By the time he reached the canyon, 3 hours had passed, and the sun had climbed high enough to warm the air. The canyon walls rose steep and grey on both sides, pocked with lichen and narrow ledges where juniper trees clung to cracks in the stone. He parked the ATV on the north rim, unloaded the tools, and stood at the edge looking across to the far side, imagining the bridge suspended in the gap. He spent the first day drilling anchor points into the rock. He'd brought a portable hammer drill powered by the ATV's generator, and he set up at the first anchor location, marking 4 points in a rectangular pattern that would distribute the load across multiple bolts. The drill bit chewed slowly through the basalt, the tool vibrating in his hands and throwing rock dust into his face despite the safety glasses. Each hole took nearly 40 minutes to drill to the required depth, 8 inches, and by the time he finished the first set of 4 holes, his arms ached from holding the tool steady and his shoulders burned from the sustained tension. He took a break, drank water, and started on the second set of anchor points 20 feet downstream, where the second cable would attach. The work was monotonous and exhausting, and several times he caught himself wondering if Eric was right, if this was wasted effort, if the crossing would be fine and he'd end up with nothing to show for his work except a bridge nobody used. By the time he finished drilling all 8 holes, 4 on each side of the canyon, the sun had dropped behind the ridge and the temperature had started to fall. He mixed epoxy resin with hardener in small batches, working quickly before it set, and placed threaded rods into each hole. The rods were 3/4-inch diameter galvanized steel, 12 inches long, and he set them deep so that 8 inches remained exposed for attaching the cable hardware. He used a level to make sure each rod angled slightly upward, which would help transfer the cable tension into the rock, rather than trying to pull the bolts out. The epoxy would need 24 hours to cure fully, so he packed up his tools and drove back to the ranch in the dark, his headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the trees. The next morning at breakfast, Eric asked where James had been all day yesterday, and James said he'd started work on the bridge. Eric leaned back in his chair and said he'd driven past the main crossing yesterday afternoon, and the water was still low, barely moving, no different than any other march. He said James was wasting effort on a solution to a problem that didn't exist, and if he had that much free time, maybe he could help with the equipment maintenance instead, because the feed truck had a transmission issue that needed attention. Anna looked up from her phone and said her friend's dad had built a treehouse last summer, and everyone thought that was dumb too, but at least a treehouse was fun and you could hang out in it. She said nobody was going to hang out in James's bridge because it was just a bridge in the middle of nowhere. Laura didn't say anything, but James saw the look on her face, the mix of frustration and concern that meant she was biting back words she didn't want to say in front of the others. He finished his breakfast in silence and went out to help Eric with the transmission, and they worked together without talking much, the earlier friction still present but unacknowledged. James went back to the bridge site the following weekend. The epoxy had cured and the anchor rods were solid. not moving even when he pulled on them with all his strength. He brought the first spool of cable, uncoiling it carefully on the north rim, and securing one end to a set of shackles he'd bolted to the anchor rods. The cable was heavy and stiff, and he had to work it slowly to avoid kinks that would weaken the steel. He rigged a temporary throw line, a lighter rope weighted at one end, and hurled it across the canyon. It took 6 tries before the weight cleared the far side and dropped where he could retrieve it later. He walked around the canyon rim, a 20-minute hike, and pulled the throw line across until he could grab the end of the steel cable. He then pulled the steel cable across hand over hand, the weight of it significant enough that he had to brace himself and pull in stages, resting when his arms gave out. Once the cable reached the far side, he secured it temporarily with rope and went back to the north rim. The cable now sagged across the canyon in a loose catenary curve, hanging low enough that the midpoint nearly touched the creek below. He spent the rest of the day tensioning it with the turnbuckles, checking the load with a spring scale he'd borrowed from the feed store. The goal was to get the sag to about 10% of the span, 6 feet below the level of the anchor points at mid-span. Too much sag, and the bridge would bounce dangerously under weight. Too little, and the tension would overload the anchors and the cable might pull free from the rock. He adjusted the turnbuckles in quarter-turn increments, walking back and forth across the canyon rim to check the curve from both sides. The process was tedious and required constant recalibration because each adjustment on one side affected the tension on the other. By sunset, he'd gotten the cable close to the target profile, and he marked the turnbuckle positions with paint so he could replicate them on the second cable. Over the next 2 weeks, he worked in the early mornings before the ranch work started, and on weekends when he could steal a few hours. He installed the second cable parallel to the first, creating a pair of main load-bearing lines separated by 3 feet. The process went faster the second time because he'd learned the technique, but it was still exhausting work that required precision and patience. Once both cables were tensioned properly, he started building the deck. He cut 2x6 planks into 60-inch lengths and drilled holes near each end, then threaded lighter rope through the holes and laced the planks to the main cables. Each plank added weight to the system, and the added load caused the cables to sag further, requiring him to retension them twice as the deck progressed. He worked methodically, adding 8 planks per session, spacing them 8 inches apart to save weight while still providing a continuous walking surface. The work went slowly because he could only devote a few hours at a time, and the regular ranch duties always took priority. There were fences to mend, cattle to check, equipment that broke down and needed fixing. Eric needed help moving a group of yearlings to fresh pasture, and that took 2 full days of riding and sorting. Laura needed help replacing a section of water line that had frozen and cracked over the winter, and that took another day of digging and plumbing. James fit the bridge work into the gaps, working early and late, and sometimes he'd arrive at the canyon and work until his hands were too cold or too tired to continue, then drive home and collapse into bed without eating dinner. Laura noticed he was losing weight and asked if he was feeling okay, and James said he was fine, just busy, and Laura said busy with the wrong things. The engineering principle behind a simple suspension bridge is load distribution through tensile strength. The main cables carry the vertical load by converting it into horizontal tension at the anchor points and vertical compression at the support points. The deck transfers its weight to the cables through hangers, or, in a simpler design like James's, through direct attachment. The catenary curve is critical because it determines how efficiently the cables distribute the load. A perfectly calculated sag allows the cable to carry maximum weight with minimum stress concentration at any single point. If the sag is too steep, if the curve droops too low, then the bridge will exhibit excessive vertical motion under load, bouncing and swaying in ways that feel unstable and can actually cause fatigue failure in the cable strands over time. If the sag is too shallow, if the cables are pulled too taut, then the horizontal tension becomes enormous, and the anchor points experience forces far beyond what the design intended, risking sudden catastrophic failure if a bolt pulls out or the rock fractures. James had learned the basic math from a civil engineering textbook he'd picked up at a library sale years ago, a worn textbook from the 1970s with hand-drawn diagrams and worked examples. The book had a section on suspension bridges, And while the examples dealt with massive structures spanning rivers and highways, the underlying principles scaled down just fine. A properly tensioned steel cable rated for £3,000, divided across a 60-foot span with a 10% sag, could safely support a dynamic load of at least £500, more than enough for a person weighing £200 carrying another £100 of supplies. The safety factor was generous, about 3 to 1, which meant the bridge could theoretically handle £1,500 before approaching the cable's rated capacity. James had designed for that margin deliberately, knowing that real-world conditions always introduced variables the calculations didn't capture: wind loading, dynamic motion, fatigue over time, temperature effects on the steel. Better to overbuild and waste a bit of material than underbuild and risk a failure. He added handrails last. He strung lighter rope along both sides of the deck and attached vertical supports every 6 feet, creating a railing about waist high. The handrails didn't carry structural load. They weren't supporting the deck or the people on it, but they made the crossing feel safer and gave someone a handhold if they needed to steady themselves against the sway. He tested the whole structure himself first, walking across slowly with his weight on the balls of his feet, feeling the bounce and sway, checking for any plank that felt loose or any rope that seemed overstressed. The bridge moved under him, but the motion felt controlled and predictable. There was a rhythmic bounce as he walked, a slight sway when he shifted his weight laterally, but nothing that felt dangerous or out of control. When he reached the far side, he turned around and walked back faster, testing the dynamic loading, and the bridge responded smoothly, absorbing the energy and damping out the oscillations without any sharp feedback or resonance. He walked across 3 more times, each time with more confidence, and by the end he felt certain the structure would hold. By the 3rd week of March, the bridge was functionally complete. James stood at the canyon rim one evening and looked at the finished structure stretching across the gap, and for the first time in weeks he felt a small measure of satisfaction. The bridge wasn't pretty. The cables showed rust in a few spots despite being galvanized. Some of the planks had split ends, and the handrails sagged in places where he hadn't laced them tightly enough, but it would work when it needed to. It was functional infrastructure, built to solve a specific problem, and whether or not anyone else appreciated it didn't change the fact that it existed now and could be used if the need arose. He took a photo with his phone, more for documentation than celebration, and drove home as the light faded and the temperature dropped toward freezing. He invited Laura to see it the following Sunday. They drove up the logging trail together in the ATV, and when they reached the canyon, James parked and gestured toward the bridge and said he wanted her to cross it with him. Laura stood at the edge, looking down at the water 20 feet below, the creek still low and peaceful at this point, and said she didn't think it was safe. James said he'd tested it multiple times, and the cables were rated for far more than their combined weight, and Laura said she'd rather not. She asked how much time he'd spent on the project, and when he estimated somewhere around 80 hours, she closed her eyes and said 80 hours they couldn't get back, 80 hours he could have spent on things that actually needed fixing around the ranch. James said the bridge was fixing something, just not something broken yet, and Laura said that was the problem. If it wasn't broken, it didn't need fixing. They drove back to the ranch in silence, and when they got home, Laura went straight inside without saying goodnight. The argument resurfaced a few days later. Eric had noticed the time James was spending on the bridge and commented at dinner that maybe James should focus more on ranch business and less on hobby projects. James said the bridge wasn't a hobby, it was insurance, and Eric said insurance against what? A flood that had never happened in recorded history. James said just because something hadn't happened didn't mean it wouldn't. And Eric said that logic would justify preparing for asteroid strikes and zombie apocalypses too. Anna laughed at that, and even Laura smiled despite herself. And James felt the 3 of them aligning against him, unified in their skepticism. He tried explaining one more time about the snowpack and the weather patterns and the capacity limits of the main crossing, but he could see their attention drifting, their expressions shifting into that polite glaze people put on when they're waiting for you to stop talking. He gave up mid-sentence and cleared his plate and went outside to check on the cattle, and by the time he came back inside, everyone had gone to bed. The first warm spell hit in early April. Temperatures climbed into the mid-60s for 3 straight days, and the snowpack in the high country started to soften. James drove down to the main crossing and saw the water had risen 6 inches, enough to cover some of the smaller rocks, but still well below the level where it would threaten the roadbed. He took photos on his phone and noted the time and the temperature, starting to document what he suspected might become a developing situation. He mentioned it at dinner, showing the photos, and Eric said 6 inches was nothing, that he'd seen it rise that much plenty of times, and it always went back down. Anna said she was tired of hearing about the creek, and could they please talk about something else for once, like literally anything else. Laura said maybe they could talk about vacation plans for the summer, and James said he'd be happy to talk about vacation plans once they were sure they'd still have access to town, and Laura said he was being dramatic again. He checked the crossing again 2 days later and found the water had risen another 4 inches. The current moved faster now, pushing against the upstream side of the rocks and creating small standing waves where the flow pinched through the narrows. He drove up into the high country to check the snowpack and found it melting rapidly, the snowline retreating uphill and small streams cutting channels through the drifts. The air temperature at elevation was in the 50s, warm enough to sustain continuous melt, and the forecast called for temperatures to climb even higher over the next week. He did rough calculations based on the snowpack volume and the expected melt rate, and the numbers suggested the peak flow would hit sometime in mid-April, possibly reaching levels 2 or 3 times higher than normal spring maximums. He wrote the calculations in his notebook and tried showing them to Eric that evening, but Eric waved them away and said he wasn't interested in theoretical math. He'd believe there was a problem when he could see it with his own eyes. On April 9th, the weather shifted. A high-pressure system stalled over the valley, and temperatures spiked into the low 80s, temperatures more typical of June than April. The snow in the high country didn't melt gradually over weeks like it normally did. It melted fast and all at once, like someone had turned on a faucet. James woke before dawn. He'd been waking early for days now, unable to sleep through the night, and drove to the main crossing in the pre-dawn grey. When he stepped out of the truck, he could hear the creek before he saw it. The sound had changed from the low murmur he'd known his whole life to a steady roar that carried across the valley. When he reached the bank, he saw the water had jumped nearly 2 feet overnight. It surged through the crossing now, brown and churning with suspended sediment, carrying broken branches and foam. The roadbed was still above water, but the margin had narrowed to less than a foot, and the current hit the rocks with enough force to throw spray across the gravel. James stood there for 10 minutes, watching the level hold steady, and then he drove back to the ranch and woke Eric. He said they needed to haul 2 weeks' worth of supplies from town immediately because the crossing might not be passable much longer. Eric stumbled out of bed, looked at the clock, it was 5:30 in the morning, and asked if James was serious. James said completely serious, that the water had risen 2 feet overnight and would keep rising as long as the melt continued, and they needed to stockpile supplies while they still could. Eric got dressed, and they drove down to the crossing together. And when Eric saw the water, he went quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay, maybe James had a point. Maybe they should make a supply run." They went back to the house and told Laura they were going into town, and Laura asked why so early. And Eric said because James thought the crossing might flood soon. Laura looked skeptical, but said fine. If they wanted to drive into town at dawn, that was their choice. They made 2 trips that day, filling both trucks with groceries, fuel cans, livestock feed, medications, spare parts for equipment, and anything else they thought they might need if they got cut off. Between trips, James checked the crossing and saw the water had risen another 4 inches. By the time they finished the second trip and returned in the late afternoon, the water had risen another 6 inches and now flowed over the low point of the roadbed in a shallow sheet, maybe 2 inches deep, moving fast enough to push against their boots when they waded out to check the condition of the gravel. James said they should make one more trip to move the vehicles to the far side while they still could, and Eric said he didn't think that was necessary yet. The water was still shallow enough to drive through, and they'd just be inconveniencing themselves if they parked the trucks away from the ranch. James said inconvenience now was better than being stranded later, and Eric said James was still assuming the worst case when they didn't know yet if that would happen. That evening at dinner, James tried one more time to explain his reasoning. He laid out the facts methodically: the snowpack volume, the melt rate, the capacity limits of the crossing, the trajectory of the water level over the past week. He said the crossing was designed to handle normal seasonal variation, maybe a 20 or 30% increase in flow, but the current melt event was already producing 50% more flow than normal and would likely exceed 100% more by tomorrow. At that level, the crossing would be underwater and the current would start eroding the gravel road bed. Once the erosion started, it would accelerate, and within a day or two, the crossing would be completely impassable. He said they had maybe 12 to 18 hours to move the vehicles before that window closed, and once it closed, they'd be cut off from town until the water receded, which could take a week or more depending on how long the melt lasted. Laura listened to all of this and said it sounded plausible in theory, but in practice the crossing had never failed before, and she still thought James was overreacting. Eric said he'd be willing to move the trucks tomorrow if the water kept rising, but not tonight. Anna said nothing, absorbed in her phone, and the conversation died without resolution. James couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed listening to the sound of the creek, a dull roar that carried through the walls and seemed to grow louder with each passing hour. The sound had presence and weight, a bass frequency rumble that you felt as much as heard, and it spoke to the sheer volume of water moving through the valley. Around 2 in the morning he got up, dressed quietly, and drove down to the crossing with a flashlight. The water had risen another 8 inches since sunset. It surged across the roadbed now in a flow nearly a foot deep, tearing at the gravel and carrying away smaller stones that tumbled and clicked along the bottom. The downstream side of the crossing had started to erode visibly, the edge crumbling where the current hit it and dropped off into deeper water. He stood there in the dark, alone, watching his flashlight beam catch the spray and the turbulence, and he understood with absolute certainty that the crossing was going to fail. The only question was when, and whether they'd have moved the vehicles before it happened. He drove back to the house, woke Laura and Eric by turning on the lights, and told them they needed to move the vehicles immediately, right now, not tomorrow morning. Laura sat up in bed and said he was being ridiculous, that it was 2 in the morning and the creek would be fine for a few more hours. Eric said he wasn't moving anything at 2 in the morning for a problem that might not even materialize by daylight. James said the problem was materializing right now, that the downstream edge of the crossing was eroding, and they had maybe 3 or 4 hours before a vehicle couldn't make it through safely. He said he was moving the trucks, whether they helped him or not, and if they wanted to be cut off from their own vehicles, that was their choice. Laura said he was being dramatic again, and Eric said he'd deal with it in the morning, and James realized he was arguing with people who'd made up their minds and wouldn't be convinced by anything short of disaster itself. He went alone. He took the keys to the first truck from the hook by the door and drove down to the crossing. The approach was already partially flooded, the water spreading beyond the normal channel and covering the low spots in the road. He eased the truck forward, feeling the current push hard against the doors, the water splashing over the hood and hammering against the windshield. The tires lost traction twice, spinning briefly before catching on rocks, and he gunned the engine both times, feeling the truck lurch forward and then stabilize. The crossing took maybe 15 seconds to traverse, but those 15 seconds felt like minutes, every moment carrying the risk that the current would shift the gravel under his tires or push the truck sideways into deeper water. When he reached the far side, he exhaled hard and realized he'd been holding his breath. He parked the truck on high ground near the canyon trail and waded back across the crossing on foot. The water came up to his knees now, pushing hard enough that he had to brace himself with each step and use his hands on the rocks to keep his balance. The current pulled at his legs and tried to sweep his feet out from under him, and halfway across he slipped and went down to his waist before catching himself and scrambling back upright. By the time he reached the north bank, his jeans were soaked and his boots were full of water, and he was breathing hard from the effort and the adrenaline. He went back to the house, grabbed the keys to the second truck and drove it across the same way. The water was deeper now, maybe 14 inches, and the crossing took longer because he had to navigate around a section where the gravel had washed away entirely, leaving a gap that forced him to angle upstream and then back down. The second truck made it through, but barely, and when he parked it next to the first, he knew he'd just made the last vehicle crossing that would be possible. The ATV was still on the north side, and he debated leaving it, But in the end he waded back a third time, the water now mid-thigh and the current strong enough that he had to move sideways, feet wide, shuffling step by step, and rode the ATV across. The machine was lighter than the trucks and the water nearly swamped the engine, but he kept the throttle steady and the momentum carried him through. He parked it next to the trucks and waded back a final time, and this crossing was the hardest. The water deeper still, and his energy depleted, and the darkness absolute except for the narrow cone of his flashlight. He made it across, but only just, and when he reached the north bank he collapsed on the gravel and lay there for a minute catching his breath. When he walked back to the house, soaked and exhausted at 4 in the morning, Laura was waiting in the kitchen. She asked why he'd done it, and he said because now they had a way to get to town if they needed to. She said they didn't need to get to town. They'd just stockpiled 2 weeks of supplies the day before, and he said 2 weeks wasn't forever. And besides, they might have medical emergencies or other reasons to leave that they couldn't predict. She asked if he'd risked his life crossing in the dark, and he said it was risky but manageable, and it would have been riskier to wait until morning when the water would be even higher. She didn't say anything else, just shook her head and went back upstairs, and James sat at the kitchen table dripping water onto the floor until the sun came up. He slept for 3 hours and woke to daylight and the sound of the creek louder than before. He walked down to check the crossing and found the water had risen another foot overnight. It surged over the roadbed now in a violent brown torrent, 3 feet deep at the center, carrying branches and debris and moving with enough force to knock a person off their feet instantly. The downstream edge of the crossing had collapsed entirely, leaving a 6-foot vertical drop where the current boiled and churned and created a standing wave that threw spray 10 feet into the air. The crossing was gone. Not impassable. Gone. There was no longer a route that even the most determined or reckless person could attempt. The creek had reclaimed the crossing, erasing 50 years of use in a single night, and the evidence of its permanence. The gravel his grandfather had hauled, the rocks his father had placed, lay scattered across the stream bed or buried under silt. James stood there staring at the water, and his first thought was relief that he'd moved the vehicles, and his second thought was that the bridge was now the only way across. He walked back to the house and gathered the family in the kitchen. Eric was making coffee and Laura was starting breakfast and Anna was still in bed, and he waited until they were all present before he spoke. He explained that the main crossing was gone, completely impassable, and would likely stay that way for at least a week, possibly longer, depending on how fast the melt progressed and how long it took the water to recede and the county to come rebuild. He said the trucks were on the far side, parked near the canyon, and if anyone needed to leave the ranch for any reason, the bridge was the only route. He said the bridge was safe and tested and ready to use, and they should treat it as their primary access until the main crossing was repaired. Eric stood up from the table and said this was exactly what he'd been worried about, that James's paranoia had just stranded them on their own property. James said that was backwards, that moving the vehicles had saved them from being stranded without vehicles at all, and the bridge gave them mobility they wouldn't otherwise have. Eric said he didn't care about the logic, he cared about the practical reality, which was that they were now cut off from town except for some homemade rope bridge that James had built in his spare time. Laura said she didn't want anyone using the bridge because it wasn't safe, and James said it was safe because he'd engineered it specifically for this situation. Laura said engineering required a degree and professional certification, not a library book, and 80 hours of amateur construction, and James said the principles were the same regardless of who applied them. Anna came downstairs during the argument and asked what was happening, and when they explained, she said this was insane and she had things to do in town and couldn't be stuck at the ranch for a week. The argument went in circles until Eric finally said he needed to get to town that morning because he had an appointment with the ranch accountant to file quarterly taxes, and the appointment couldn't be rescheduled without penalty. James said he'd drive Eric to the bridge and they'd go together, and Eric said he wasn't crossing some rope bridge just to keep an appointment. James said the alternative was missing the appointment and paying the penalty, and Eric said he'd wade across the main crossing instead. James said that was suicide. The current would sweep him away instantly, and the downstream drop meant drowning in turbulent water with no possibility of rescue. Eric said he'd decide what was safe for himself, and James said fine, let's go look at it together, and then Eric could decide. They drove down to the main crossing in James's remaining ATV, the one he'd kept on the north side for local use, and Eric stood at the edge looking at the water. Up close, the danger was undeniable. The current moved at a speed that would sweep a person downstream before they could take 3 steps, and the violence of the water made it clear that anyone who fell would be battered against rocks and drowned within seconds. The roar was so loud they had to shout to be heard, and the spray soaked them even standing 10 feet from the edge. Eric stared at it for a long time, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty to resignation, and then he turned and walked back to the ATV without saying anything. James drove him up to the canyon where the bridge spanned the gap, and they stood together at the canyon rim. The bridge stretched across the void, swaying slightly in the wind that funneled through the canyon. The planks were dark against the grey stone walls, and the cables caught the morning light, and the whole structure looked fragile and temporary compared to the solid gravel crossing they'd used their whole lives. Eric looked at it and said he still thought it was a bad idea, but he didn't have a better one. James crossed first, walking slowly and keeping his hands on the rope handrails, demonstrating the technique. Step in the center of each plank, move with the sway instead of fighting it, don't look down. When he reached the far side, he turned and called back that it was stable, and Eric could cross safely. Eric followed, moving carefully, testing each plank before putting his full weight on it, gripping the handrails with white knuckles. The bridge bounced and swayed under him, and halfway across he stopped and stood completely still for 10 seconds, and James thought he might turn back. But then Eric took a breath and kept moving. When he made it across, he exhaled slowly and said, "Okay, it works." He guessed James had been right about that at least. They walked down to where James had parked the trucks, and Eric drove into town for his appointment, while James waited by the bridge. The appointment took 3 hours, and when Eric came back he crossed the bridge again with more confidence, and on the drive back to the ranch he admitted that maybe James had been smart to build it, that without it they'd have been completely stuck. James said he appreciated that, and Eric said it didn't mean he was happy about being proven wrong, just that he recognized the reality of their situation. They drove back in a silence that felt different than the silences before, less hostile, more contemplative. Over the next 3 days, the bridge proved itself in increments. Laura needed to pick up a prescription from the pharmacy in town. She'd been managing blood pressure medication, and the refill couldn't wait another week, and she crossed with James guiding her, gripping the handrails tightly and moving 1 step at a time with her eyes fixed on the far side. She didn't speak during the crossing, and when she reached the far side she sat down on a rock for a minute to calm her nerves before they drove to town. Anna crossed to meet friends in town, complaining the whole way about how inconvenient it was, and how she'd have to carry anything she bought because you couldn't drive stuff back, but she made the crossing without incident, and actually admitted afterward that it wasn't as scary as she'd thought it would be. Each crossing reinforced the same reality. The bridge was the only reason they could still function as a family. The main crossing remained impassable, the water holding high as the melt continued, and without the alternate route, the family would have been isolated completely. No way to get to work, to school, to medical care, to grocery stores, to anything. James kept a log in his notebook, recording each crossing with the time and the person and what they carried, and by the end of the first week, the tally showed 28 crossings carrying everything from groceries to mail to a replacement part for the water pump. The bridge had become infrastructure, woven into the daily routine, and nobody called it paranoia anymore. On the 4th day, a UPS delivery truck arrived at the main crossing from the south, attempting to deliver a package Anna had ordered online. The driver saw the flooded creek, took a photo for documentation, and turned around. Later that afternoon, the dispatch center called Eric's cell phone asking how they wanted to handle deliveries while the crossing was out. Eric explained that the main crossing was impassable, but they had a pedestrian bridge upstream and could pick up packages in town. The dispatcher said they couldn't reroute the truck through unmarked fire roads for one address because of insurance and liability, and Eric said they'd pick up packages at the depot in town then. After the call, Eric sat at the kitchen table and said out loud that if James hadn't built the bridge, they'd be completely cut off, not just from their trucks, but from everything. And maybe James had been right to build it after all. Laura nodded and said she'd been thinking the same thing. Anna didn't say anything at the time, but later that evening she found James outside checking cattle and said quietly that she was sorry for making fun of the bridge, that she saw now why he'd built it. The measurable proof came in the form of supply runs and logistics. Over the next 10 days, the family crossed the bridge 43 times, moving groceries, fuel, equipment parts, medical supplies, mail, and themselves back and forth as needed. James kept the tally in his notebook, recording not just the number of crossings, but also the weight of cargo carried. The heaviest single load was 60 pounds, a propane tank that Eric had to carry across carefully, holding it in front of him and moving slowly to avoid throwing the bridge into oscillation. The total cargo moved across the bridge over those 10 days exceeded 2,000 pounds, all of it in increments small enough that no single trip exceeded the bridge's safety margins, but collectively representing everything the family needed to maintain their lives while cut off from vehicle access. The main crossing remained impassable for 16 days total. The water peaked on day 5, and then started a slow decline as the melt tapered off and the temperatures moderated. But even after the flow dropped below the level of the roadbed, the damage was too severe to allow vehicles through. When the water finally receded enough to inspect the damage, James and Eric walked down together to survey what remained. The downstream side of the crossing had eroded badly, with a 10-foot section of roadbed completely washed away and the gravel scattered across the creek bed downstream. The larger rocks James's father had placed were gone entirely, either buried under sediment or carried away by the current. The bedrock was exposed in places, scoured clean by the force of the water, and the whole structure of the crossing had been fundamentally altered. Eric stood there looking at the damage and said they'd need to bring in a contractor with heavy equipment to rebuild, and James said probably that this wasn't something they could fix themselves with shovels and gravel. Eric called the county road department to ask about assistance, since the crossing served as their only vehicle access, and the county said they'd send an engineer to assess the damage, but couldn't commit to repair funding because it was private property. Eric called a local contractor who specialized in rural roadwork, and the contractor came out 2 days later, assessed the site, and quoted $8,000 for the repair, excavation, new gravel, properly sized culverts to prevent future washouts, and grade elevation to handle higher flows. Eric authorized the work, and the contractor started the following week, bringing in a small excavator and a dump truck and spending 3 days rebuilding the crossing to higher standards than it had ever met before. While the contractor worked, James and Eric stood at the edge watching the progress, and Eric did the math out loud. The bridge had cost maybe $1,200 in materials and 80 hours of labor, and it had kept them mobile through a disaster that would have otherwise stranded them completely. Without the bridge, they would have been cut off for 16 days, unable to work, unable to access medical care, unable to get supplies beyond what they'd stockpiled. With the bridge, they'd stayed connected, maintained their routines, and continued their lives with only minor inconvenience. Eric said it out loud, and James nodded and said that was about right. Eric said he wished he'd listened sooner, and James said hindsight was easy, and the important thing was they'd made it through without anyone getting hurt, and without any real hardship beyond the time and effort of crossing on foot. Laura joined them later that afternoon and said the same thing, that she wished she'd believed James when he first warned them about the risk, and James said most people didn't take risks seriously until they saw the consequences, and that was just human nature. Laura asked how he'd known to take it seriously when nobody else did, and James said he hadn't known, not with certainty. He'd just understood the risk was real enough to warrant preparation, even if it seemed unlikely. He said people confused unlikely with impossible and stopped preparing when they should have been preparing harder, and the only way to break that pattern was to imagine consequences vividly enough to motivate action before the moment arrived. Anna came down to the crossing that evening and took photos of the damaged roadbed with her phone. She posted them on social media with a caption about how her dad had built a bridge and saved them from being stranded. And within an hour, the post had been shared dozens of times, and people were commenting about how smart James had been to prepare ahead. Anna showed James the comments, and he read through them with a mix of embarrassment and validation, uncomfortable with the praise, but also grateful that people were seeing the lesson in the story. One comment stood out. from someone who lived in a mountain valley similar to theirs. This is why you prepare for the thing that hasn't happened yet. By the time it happens, it's too late. James read it twice and felt like someone else had finally articulated what he'd been trying to explain for months. The contractor finished rebuilding the main crossing in early May, installing a large culvert under the roadbed to channel the creek and prevent future overtopping, and raising the grade by 18 inches to handle flows significantly higher than historical maximums. The new crossing was overbuilt by design, rated to handle 100-year flood events, and the contractor said it should last 30 years with minimal maintenance. The family started using it again the day it opened, and the convenience of driving straight through instead of walking to the bridge and back felt almost luxurious after 16 days of the alternate route. But James maintained the bridge anyway. He hiked up to the canyon every 2 weeks to check the tension in the cables, to inspect the planks for rot or damage, and to replace anything that had weathered. He tightened the turnbuckles when the cables stretched, replaced 3 planks that had split during freeze-thaw cycles, and added a second set of handrails at a lower height for Anna to use if she crossed alone. When Laura asked why he bothered maintaining it, he said it was there if they needed it again, and infrastructure only worked if you took care of it. Herrick agreed, and the following spring, when the forecast started calling for another heavy snowpack, Eric was the first to suggest they check the bridge and make sure it was ready. Laura agreed, and Anna helped James carry new planks up the logging trail to replace the ones that had weathered over the winter. The family didn't ignore him anymore, not about infrastructure or preparedness, or the lessons risk could teach when you paid attention. When James mentioned a concern about the well pump that sounded like it was wearing out, about the generator that needed a tune-up before winter, about the backup heating system that hadn't been tested in years, people listened and took action. The dynamic had shifted from dismissal to respect, and while James didn't enjoy having been proven right through disaster, he understood that sometimes that was the only teacher that got through. He stood at the canyon rim one evening that second spring, looking at the bridge stretching across the gap, and thought about how often people only learned through consequences. The bridge had been obvious to him, the risk clear, the solution straightforward, but convincing others had required proof they couldn't argue with. The flood had provided that proof, and the cost had been high enough to change minds, but low enough that nobody got hurt. He considered that a kind of luck, the narrow margin between a lesson and a tragedy, and he wondered how many other risks were building in the margins of daily life, invisible until they weren't. The thought didn't scare him, it just made him pay attention. He made a mental list of other vulnerabilities on the ranch: electrical systems that were old, water storage that was inadequate, communications that depended on a single cell tower, and started thinking about which ones to address first. Not with panic or paranoia, just with the same methodical preparation he'd applied to the bridge. Identify the risk, design a solution, build it before you need it. The creek ran low now, the spring melt finished, and the water dropping back to its summer trickle. Somewhere downstream, sediment from the washout had settled into new patterns, and the shape of the crossing had changed in ways only the water remembered. The rebuilt roadbed looked permanent from the surface, but James knew better than to assume permanence. Infrastructure was always temporary, always negotiating with forces larger than itself, and the only question was whether you prepared for the negotiation or waited for it to come to you. The bridge remained, spanning the canyon in a taut curve of steel and rope, ready for the next time someone needed it. And next time someone would, because risk didn't ask permission and preparation only mattered if you finished it before the moment arrived. James walked back to the ATV and drove home through the long evening light, the bridge behind him and the ranch ahead, and the family waiting for dinner with a different understanding than they'd had before. They'd learned what he'd known all along, that ignoring a risk didn't make it disappear, and that the time to build the bridge was before the crossing washed out. The lesson had cost them 16 days of inconvenience and $8,000 in repairs, but it had saved them from something much worse. And maybe that was the whole point, not to avoid consequences entirely, but to make sure the consequences you faced were ones you could survive.